The young billionaire flirted with an old woman, and you won't believe what happened. Steve spotted her from across the park, silver hair catching the afternoon light, dressed in understated linen that somehow looked more expensive than anything in his closet. She sat alone on a bench, reading a leather-bound book, the kind people didn't carry anymore unless they actually meant to read it. Perfect, he thought. A little game to pass the time. He approached with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "Excuse me, but I have to say, you have incredible presence." She glanced up barely. "Do I?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm surprised we haven't crossed paths before. I'm usually very good at noticing elegant women." "Maybe," she said, turning a page, "we're not supposed to cross paths." Steve smiled wider. "But we're meeting now, so that means we're supposed to." She looked at him then, really looked, and something in her eyes made his pulse quicken in a way he didn't expect. "What's your name?" he asked. Press. Beautiful. I'm Steve. Steve Sterling. I know who you are." That caught him off guard, but he recovered quickly. "Then you know I don't usually do this, talk to strangers in parks. But there's something about you." "Is there?" Her voice was velvet wrapped around steel. "Definitely. You remind me of someone who knows the value of the finer things in life. Someone who deserves to be appreciated by someone who understands quality." Press closed her book slowly. "Steve Sterling, you've spent so much time looking at your own reflection that you've forgotten how to read the room." His smile faltered. "I'm sorry. You're currently 4% down on the NASDAQ." She stood, meeting his eyes with the weight of an iron vault. "And you're flirting with the woman who owns the 10% voting bloc your board is trying to steal." Steve's world tilted. The park, the bench, the afternoon light. Everything suddenly felt like a stage he'd stumbled onto without knowing his lines. "I don't. Believe me." Press smiled, and it wasn't kind. "You will. Because the woman you tried to charitably flirt with is about to teach you that in the real world, power doesn't need to shout to be felt." She walked away, leaving Steve standing alone with the terrifying realization that he wasn't the predator in this park. He was the prey. Before we get into the main story, let me know in the comments section where you are watching from. Subscribe and share because I have more interesting stories to share with you. Steve's hands were shaking when he got back to his penthouse. He poured himself scotch, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and pulled up his phone with fingers that felt clumsy and foreign. A quick search confirmed what he already knew but desperately wanted to deny. Press Henderson, former chief investment officer of Meridian Capital, dubbed the Oracle of Wall Street before her sudden retirement 5 years ago. Net worth estimated at somewhere north of $8 billion, though she'd stopped letting Forbes count after the first 3. The woman he'd patronized with his charm. The woman he'd treated like she should be grateful for his attention. His phone buzzed. A text from Kane, his COO. Board meeting moved up to Thursday. "Something's happening." Steve's stomach dropped. Thursday was 3 days away. He typed back, "What do you mean something's happening?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Can't talk on text. Come to the office." The Sterling Technologies headquarters occupied 40 floors of prime real estate, but Steve took the private elevator straight to Kane's corner office, bypassing the admiring glances and deferential nods he usually collected like trophies. Kane was waiting with a tablet and an expression that made Steve's scotch threaten to come back up. "Jonathan Vance has been buying up shares through shell companies," Kane said without preamble. "We didn't catch it until yesterday because he's been smart about it, spreading the purchases across dozens of entities. He's got about 38% now." Jonathan Vance. Steve's former mentor, the man he'd publicly humiliated 2 years ago when he'd poached Vance's entire development team and launched the product that made Sterling Tech a household name. Vance had smiled at the press conference, congratulated Steve on his innovation, and said nothing about the betrayal. Steve should have known better than to think a man like that would simply forgive. 38 isn't controlling, Steve said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. It is if he convinces enough of the board to vote with him. And Steve, he's been talking to people. Private dinners, golf games, the whole campaign. They're calling it restoring experienced leadership to Sterling Tech. Kane's expression was grim. The narrative is that you're brilliant but reckless. That the company needs someone who understands sustainable growth. That's bullshit. Our stock price is down 4% this week, yes. I know. Kane set down the tablet. There's a rumor about a silent partner. Someone with a significant stake who's been off the books. If Vance has gotten to them. Steve thought of Press' smile, the way she'd looked at him like he was a child playing dress-up in his father's suit. 10% voting block, she'd said. The missing piece Vance needed to complete his coup. And Steve had just spent the afternoon proving to her exactly why he didn't deserve to keep his company. Steve's legal team had been searching for the ghost shareholder for 8 months. It had started as a curiosity, an anomaly in the cap table that his CFO had flagged during a routine audit. 10% of Sterling Tech's voting shares registered to something called the Anderson Foundation Trust, incorporated in Delaware with layers of privacy protection that made Swiss bank accounts look transparent. His lawyers had burned through hundreds of billable hours trying to identify the beneficial owner. They'd hit walls at every turn. Shell companies nested inside holding companies, trustees who referred them to other trustees, legal structures so elegant they were almost beautiful in their impenetrability. Whoever had built this wanted to stay hidden, and they'd paid very good lawyers to make sure they could. Steve had assumed it was some hedge fund playing games, or maybe a foreign investor avoiding scrutiny. He'd never imagined it was a woman he could meet in a park. Now he sat in his home office at 2 a.m, surrounded by documents his team had compiled. The foundation's public filings were minimal. Charitable donations to education initiatives, some healthcare projects in America, a scholarship program for women in finance. Nothing that screamed corporate warfare. But buried in an archived news article from 2019, he found a photo from a ribbon-cutting ceremony at a girls' school in London. There she was, younger, her hair more pepper than salt, but unmistakably Press. The caption identified her as Precious Anderson, founder of the Anderson Foundation, cutting the ribbon alongside the U.S. Minister of Education. Steve pulled up everything he could find on her career. The story was legendary in finance circles, though he'd never paid attention before. Why would he? The past was just prologue to people like him, irrelevant compared to the future they were building. But Press's past was remarkable. Born in Ohio, educated at LSE, she'd started at Goldman Sachs in the 80s when women, especially young women, weren't supposed to make it past analyst. She'd made partner anyway. Then she'd moved to Meridian Capital and built an investment strategy so successful they'd called her the Oracle. A perfect record of predicting market movements that seemed almost supernatural. She'd retired at 50, walked away from it all, and apparently decided to become a silent investor in promising tech companies. Sterling Tech's Series B funding round, Steve realized with creeping horror. 6 years ago, when they'd been desperate for capital and taking money from anyone who believed in the vision. The Anderson Foundation Trust had been one of their earliest institutional investors, before Steve was famous, before he'd learned to be so carefully arrogant about his own genius. She'd believed in him when he was nobody, and he just tried to flirt with her like she was someone to entertain him on a boring afternoon. His phone buzzed. An email, sent from an address that was just a string of numbers at a private domain. Mr. Sterling. My office. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone, or don't come at all. P.O. Press's office wasn't what Steve expected. No chrome and glass tower, no receptionist guarding access like a corporate Cerberus. Instead, the address led him to a converted brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people actually knew their neighbors' names. A brass plate beside the door read, Anderson Foundation, in understated letters. She answered the door herself, dressed in tailored slacks and a cream blouse that probably cost nothing and somehow looked like everything. You're on time, she said. That's something. Inside, the office was all warm wood and filled bookshelves, more library than boardroom. Press gestured to a chair across from her desk and sat with the posture of someone who'd spent decades commanding rooms full of men who'd wanted to dismiss her. I assume you've done your homework, she said. I know who you are now. I know what you own. Steve leaned forward, deploying the earnest expression that usually worked on investors. Ms. Anderson, I need your help. Jonathan Vance is trying to take my company, and your shares are the only thing that can stop him. I'm aware. Then you know how important this is. Sterling Tech isn't just my company, it's the future of. Stop. The word cut through his pitch like a blade. I don't need to hear about your vision or your mission statement. I've read your investor presentations. I've watched your TED Talks. I know exactly who you think you are. She paused. The question is whether there's anyone real underneath all that performance. Steve felt his jaw tighten. I'm not performing. This is who I am. A 28-year-old who thought flirting with a stranger in a park was a fun way to pass the time? Press's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. A man who sees a woman reading alone and assumes she must need his attention to validate her existence? I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I don't want your apology, Mr. Sterling. I want to see if you're worth saving. She opened a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I'll consider voting my shares to block Vance's takeover. But first, you're going to do something for me. Steve would have agreed to anything. Name it. Tomorrow, you'll report to St. Augustine's Community Kitchen on 5th Street. 6 a.m. You'll work a full shift, cooking, serving, cleaning, whatever Sister Margaret tells you to do. No phone. No security detail. No telling anyone who you are. Press slid the paper across the desk. It was an address and a name. If you can spend one day being useful to people who can't do anything for you, we'll talk about your company. That's it? One day. One day, Press said. Might be harder than you think. Steve arrived at St. Augustine's at 5:45, determined to prove whatever point Press wanted proven. The kitchen was already alive with activity. Industrial stoves heating up, volunteers sorting donations, the smell of coffee, and something baking filling the air. Sister Margaret turned out to be a 70-year-old woman with arms like a longshoreman and eyes that saw through bullshit with surgical precision. You Steve? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Press said you'd be coming. Said you needed to learn something. She handed him an apron. Start with the potatoes. 200 pounds need peeling for the lunch service. Steve peeled potatoes for 3 hours. His hands cramped. His back ached. The other volunteers, mostly retirees and people who looked like they'd been where the guests were not long ago, worked with quiet efficiency, occasionally offering him tips on how to hold the peeler to avoid blisters. Nobody asked why he was there. Nobody cared about his resume. Around 10, Sister Margaret pulled him aside. Someone's here to see you. Steve's stomach dropped. He'd left his phone in his car as instructed, but Kane knew where he was. If there was an emergency. But it wasn't Kane waiting in Sister Margaret's small office. It was Jonathan Vance. Vance looked exactly as Steve remembered. Silver hair perfectly styled, suit that whispered rather than shouted wealth, the smile of a man who'd already won and was just waiting for you to realize it. Steve, working on your humility, I see. What are you doing here? Same thing you are, I imagine. Trying to convince Ms. Anderson that I'm the better option. Vance settled into a chair with practiced ease. She called me this morning. Said she wanted to hear my vision for Sterling Tech's future. The words hit like ice water. Press was meeting with Vance. Today, while Steve was peeling potatoes. Though between us, Vance continued, voice dropping to something almost paternal, I think she's already made up her mind. You've had a good run, Steve. But companies need experienced leadership, not boy wonders who treat business like a game. Steve's hands were still raw from the peeler, his shirt damp with sweat that smelled like industrial kitchen and honest work. He looked at Vance in his perfect suit, positioned perfectly in the chair, and something Press had said clicked into place. I want to see if you're worth saving. This wasn't about the potatoes. It was about what happened next. Sister Margaret needs help with lunch service, Steve said, straightening. If you'll excuse me. Vance's smile flickered. You're going back to peel vegetables while I meet with your largest shareholder? I made a commitment, Steve said. I'm going to keep it. He walked out, leaving Vance sitting alone in the office, and returned to the kitchen where 200 people would need feeding and nobody cared about his stock price. Press showed up during the lunch service, slipping in through the side door while Steve was ladling soup into bowls. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her silver hair pulled back, and somehow still managed to look like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. She picked up a tray and started serving alongside him without a word. They worked in silence for 90 minutes, the rhythm of it almost meditative, scoop serve, smile, next person. Steve watched how Press spoke to each guest, really spoke to them, asking about their day, remembering names. An older man called her Miss Precious, and she lit up like he'd given her flowers. When the rush finally slowed, they took a break in the alley behind the kitchen. Steve's feet ached, and his shirt was stained with things he didn't want to identify, but he felt more awake than he had in months. "Vance came to see me this morning," Press said, leaning against the brick wall. "Offered me a position on the board after the takeover. Vice chair. Very generous compensation package." Steve's chest tightened. And I told him I'd think about it." She looked at him with those iron vault eyes. "He's a smart man. Experienced. He knows how to run a company. But he doesn't care about it," Steve said. The words came out before he could calculate them. "Sterling Tech, I mean. To him, it's just another acquisition. Another trophy. And to you." Steve thought about the nights in his dorm room, coding until his eyes burned. The first time someone had used his software and sent him an email saying it had changed how they worked. The moment he'd realized he could build something that mattered, not just something that made money. "It's mine," he said finally. "Not like property. Like it's part of me. Does that sound insane?" "No," Press said softly. "It sounds like how I felt about Meridian." She was quiet for a moment. "Why did you really come to the park yesterday, Steve?" "I was bored. I wanted—" He stopped, the rehearsed charm dying on his tongue. "I wanted to feel powerful. Important. Like I could make someone's day better just by existing." "And how do you feel now?" Steve looked at her. Really looked, the way he should have in the park. He saw the lines around her eyes that came from decades of reading balance sheets and making decisions that moved markets. The quiet strength in how she held herself, earned through rooms full of men who'd wanted her to fail. The grace of someone who'd built an empire and walked away from it because she'd found something more important. "Like I've been dating mannequins," he said. "Beautiful, empty mannequins who tell me I'm brilliant." Press laughed, and the sound was richer than any compliment he'd ever received. "Well, that's a start." The photos hit tech gossip at 6 a.m. the next morning. Steve was still asleep when Kane called, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Don't look at your phone," Kane said. "Actually, no, you need to look. Just brace yourself first." The headline was exactly what Vance would have crafted. Silicon Valley Golden Boys desperate play. Romancing elderly investor T.O. save company. Below it, a series of photos. Steve and Press in the alley behind St. Augustine's, their body language intimate in the way only telephoto lenses could make innocent moments seem predatory. Him looking at her with what the article called calculated charm. Her laughing at something he'd said, which they'd captioned as Oracle Falls for young tech bros manipulation. The article didn't mention that she was one of the most respected investors in financial history. It called her a 55-year-old former fund manager, and suggested Steve was courting her for her rumored connections to his company's early investors. The comment section was exactly what you'd expect, half calling him a gold digger going after an older woman's money, half making jokes about erectile dysfunction medication and daddy issues. By 8 a.m., it had been picked up by 6 other outlets. By 9, #StephenGranny was trending on Twitter, complete with memes comparing them to every May December romance in cinema history. Someone had created a deepfake video of Steve singing Gold Digger by Kanye West. It had 2 million views. Steve's publicist quit via email. 3 board members called asking for clarification on his relationship status and how it might affect company optics. His mother texted asking if he'd lost his mind. The only person who didn't contact him was Press. He found her at the foundation office that afternoon, sitting at her desk with a cup of tea and a tablet showing the tech gossip article. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Steve said. It's a hit job. Vance must have had someone following us. I never meant for your reputation to." "My reputation?" Press set down the tablet. "Steve, I've been called worse things by better people. The Wall Street Journal once ran a cartoon of me as a witch doctor after I correctly predicted the '08 crash. This is Tuesday for me. But they're saying I'm using you. That I'm some kind of gold digger? Gigolo? Social climber." She smiled, and there was steel in it. "They're saying that about you, not me. How does it feel?" Steve stopped. He'd been photographed with dozens of women, models, actresses, heiresses, and the coverage always made him look like the prize they'd won. But now the narrative had flipped. Now he was the one being accused of using his looks and charm for advantage, and the internet was eviscerating him for it. "It feels," he said slowly, "like maybe I understand something I should have understood a long time ago." Press poured him tea, actual tea, loose leaf in a proper pot, the ritual of it somehow steadying. She settled back in her chair and studied him with the same intensity she'd probably once used to evaluate billion-dollar positions. "You want to know why they called me the Oracle?" she asked. Steve nodded, grateful for the shift away from the photos, the scandal, the noise. Everyone assumed it was some secret formula. Complex algorithms, insider information, mathematical models that could predict the future. She took a sip of tea. "The truth is much simpler and much harder. I paid attention to what people thought didn't matter. I don't understand. Your generation, and I'm generalizing, but bear with me, you worship data. You think if you collect enough information, build a sophisticated enough AI model, you can predict anything. Remove human error from the equation." Press leaned forward. "But markets aren't made of data. They're made of people. And people are gloriously, maddeningly irrational." She pulled up a chart on her tablet, showing a stock that had crashed spectacularly in 2007. Everyone's models said this company was sound. Great fundamentals, solid leadership, impressive growth trajectory. The AI would have told you to buy. But you didn't. "No, because I had lunch with the CEO's assistant. She mentioned, casually, that he'd started smoking again after 10 years clean, that he was snapping at people in meetings, that his wife had moved out." Press eyes glinted. A man under that much personal stress makes different decisions than a man at peace. 6 months later, he made a catastrophic acquisition to prove something to himself, and the company never recovered. Steve thought about his own algorithms, the machine learning models his team had built to analyze market trends. "You're saying intuition beats data?" "I'm saying wisdom integrates both. Data tells you what happened. People tell you what's going to happen." She set down the tablet. "You know why Vance is going to lose? Because you'll vote against him? Because he thinks this is about numbers and board seats and ownership percentages. He's planned a perfect corporate coup using all the right data." Press smiled. "But he didn't account for Sister Margaret calling me yesterday to say that some young man worked harder peeling potatoes than most of her regular volunteers. He didn't factor in that the kitchen guests actually remembered your name. He certainly didn't consider that humility might be more valuable than experience." Steve felt something shift in his chest. "You already decided. Before the photos. Before any of this. I decided when you walked out of Sister Margaret's office and went back to work instead of following Vance to pitch me." She stood, extending her hand. "The board meeting is tomorrow. I suggest you prepare something to say that isn't a vision statement or a growth projection. Tell them why you deserve to lead, not why the company deserves to succeed." The boardroom felt like a courtroom. 12 faces arranged around the table, most of them carefully neutral, a few openly hostile. Jonathan Vance sat at the far end, perfectly composed, a stack of documents in front of him like evidence at a trial. Kane was there too, one of the only friendly faces, though even he looked worried. Steve had been CEO for 4 years. He'd built this company from a dorm room project into a $7 billion enterprise. And now he was standing in front of people he'd hired, people he'd made wealthy, while they prepared to vote him out. "Thank you all for coming," Vance began, his voice carrying the weight of paternal concern. "I know this is difficult, but we have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. Sterling Tech needs experienced leadership, not a 28-year-old who peaked too early." Steve interrupted. He hadn't planned to speak yet, but the words came anyway. "You can say it, Jonathan. I know what you think." Vance's smile didn't waver. "I think you're brilliant, Steve. I've always said that. But brilliance isn't enough. The market is changing. Competition is intensifying. We need someone who's navigated downturns before, who understands. Risk management, strategic patience, sustainable growth." Steve walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd conquered so quickly. "All the things I'm supposedly too young and arrogant to understand." "Steve," one of the board members said gently, No one's questioning your contributions. But the numbers speak for themselves. For consecutive quarters of declining margins. The product delays. The PR disasters. You mean the photos, Steve said. The scandal where I was photographed talking to an investor who happens to be a woman over 50. That PR disaster. The room went silent. Vance's expression flickered for just a moment, calculation worry, quickly smoothed away. This isn't personal, Vance said. This is business. And the business needs. The door opened. Press walked in wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the entire boardroom's furniture combined. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been in rooms like this when most of them were still in college. Apologies for the interruption, she said. I'm Precious Anderson. Some of you may know me as the beneficial owner of the Anderson Foundation Trust. Steve watched the realization ripple through the room. Kane's eyes widened. 3 board members reached for their tablets, pulling up cap tables. Vance went very still. 10% voting shares, Press continued, taking a seat at the table uninvited. Purchased during your Series B round, held quietly ever since. I've been watching this company grow with great interest. She folded her hands. Now, shall we discuss this vote? Because I have some thoughts on what Sterling Tech really needs. Vance's perfect composure finally cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. And what, he said carefully, do you think that is? Press smiled. Let's start with what it doesn't need. The vote wasn't even close. With Press 10% and the board members who'd been quietly uncomfortable with Vance's coup, Steve retained his position as CEO by a margin that made the whole drama seem almost anticlimactic. Vance left without a word, his perfect suit and perfect smile finally dropping the pretense of paternal concern. He simply gathered his documents and walked out, already calculating his next move in whatever game he was playing. The media went insane. Within hours, every outlet that had mocked Steve for supposedly courting an elderly investor was scrambling to reframe the narrative. The Oracle of Wall Street had emerged from retirement to save Silicon Valley's boy wonder. Think pieces proliferated about mentorship, about the value of experience, about women in finance and ageism in tech. Someone started a hashtag #PressHandSteve, which was mortifying but also strangely touching. Steve's publicist, who'd unquit once the story turned favorable, wanted to schedule joint interviews, magazine covers, maybe a TED Talk about cross-generational collaboration. Steve declined all of it. Instead, he found himself back at the foundation office 3 days later, holding 2 cups of coffee and feeling more nervous than he had in the boardroom. Press answered the door in reading glasses, a financial report in her hand. I was wondering when you'd show up. I wanted to say thank you. Properly. Without cameras or board members or... Steve. She took one of the coffees. You don't need to thank me. I voted for my investment. That's what shareholders do. It was more than that. He followed her inside, to the office that felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. You didn't just save my company. You taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn. How to peel potatoes. How to see people. He set down his coffee, suddenly needing to get the words right. All my life, I've been the youngest person in every room. The prodigy. The exception. And I started believing that youth was the only thing that mattered. That experience was just another word for obsolete. Press settled into her chair, watching him with those eyes that had seen decades of markets rise and fall. But you, Steve continued, you've forgotten more about building things than I've ever known. And not just about business, about people, about integrity, about what matters when the headlines fade. He paused. I've dated models and actresses and influencers. Beautiful people who looked good in photographs. And then I met you, and I realized I'd never actually been attracted to someone's mind before. Steve, I'm not flirting, he said quickly. I'm being honest. Maybe for the first time in years. He took a breath. I'd like to offer you a permanent seat on our board. Not as a favor. Not as gratitude. But because Sterling Tech needs what you have. And I'm smart enough now to know the difference between wanting someone to validate me and actually wanting to learn from them. Press was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, not the steel-wrapped smile from the park, but something warmer, more genuine. Vice Chair, she said, and I want voting rights on all major decisions. Done. And Steve, she leaned forward. Next time you want to impress a woman, try asking what she's reading instead of assuming she needs your attention. He laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Yes, ma'am. Outside the window, the city continued its endless motion. People chasing success, building empires, learning the hard lessons that only failure could teach. But inside the foundation office, two people who'd started as adversaries began the careful work of building something neither of them had expected. A partnership that would change how both of them saw the world, and a friendship that proved wisdom and ambition didn't have to be enemies. Steve's phone buzzed with another interview request. He silenced it without looking. Some things, he was finally learning, were more important than the performance. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. Hit the subscribe button as I will be bringing more interesting stories. Turn on your notification because you would not want to miss my story for anything.